Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is October 3rd, 2013, and my guest is Cliff Winston of the Brookings Institution. Cliff, welcome back to EconTalk.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk today about an article you've written for the Journal of Economic Literature on the transportation system of the United States. It's and we're going to put a link up to the paper itself and a video that Brookings has put together summarizing some of the points. Transportation's a pretty big part of our economy, right?
Yeah, a lot bigger than people realize. If you start, you think about it, it should be a lot, but no one, typically sort of thinks of the annual expenditures on transportation. But, when you sum these things up in terms of what consumers spend, in terms of getting to work, various pleasure trips and sort of, non-work trips, and then you look at what shippers spend on shipping freight, so on and so forth, and the government spends building infrastructure. We're talking shares of GDP, that approach the amount that we're spending on healthcare. But people obviously don't seem to pay as much attention to transportation as they do about health. And that's just out-of-pocket expenditures. It doesn't include the time expenditures, which it turns out are about as large as the monetary expenditures.
So you look at a whole range of policy issues related to transportation, including some of the history. I want to start with the history. How has the role of government in the transportation sector evolved over the history of the United States? Because it would surprise me, I probably knew this, but I'd forgotten how recently some government involvement has been, how recent some of it's been. Of course, some of it goes back a long way. So give us a quick thumbnail sketch of the sector and government's role.
Sure. I mean, actually, the interesting thing about transportation is how, although, certainly pervasive government involvement now, how virtually all components of transportation, whether they be the modes or the infrastructure, were initially started by the private sector, not the government. That is, the first roads in America actually were built by private toll or road companies. The first airports in America were private airport companies. Even air traffic control, which you think has got to be a government function, was actually set up by a private consortium, so to speak. So basically the system started out in its infancy, if you will, with the private sector, and gradually government got involved in roads, for example, regulating the roads. And then we get a familiar story as any part of the system experienced financial distress, and that certainly was going to happen, then government tended to come in. So that was sort of its entree into the road system, certainly by the early 1900s. And then other things happened during the Depression. We had airports that were private but had serious financial problems. Again, government came in and wound up taking them over, subsequently set up an air traffic control system. In the 50s, we largely had private, by the time it was the 50s, there were public transit companies as the auto came in and was competing with transit and causing it to have financial distress. And the then private companies collapsed. Again, there was regulatory issues that may have contributed to this. And again, government took over the mode. So you have sort of a familiar pattern that things started out private. There tended to be some sort of crisis. People debate to this day whether the private entities could have pulled through with government assistance. In any case, that was not forthcoming. Government wound up getting involved in taking over the operations. Those things it didn't take over, mainly on the inner city side, railroads, airlines, trucks, it stepped in and regulated them. And then we saw the withdrawal of economic regulation in the late 70s as we generally started moving away from government intervention.
Now, you don't talk about it, I don't think you do in the paper, but one area that government got involved in an unusual way would be the taxi cab market. So in many cities, highly regulated, but it's still privately run and owned. It's fascinating to me that we're living in a time now where private competitors are starting to bite into that government-run cartel or whatever you want to call it. Sometimes it's, it depends on the city, obviously, but companies like Uber and others are offering private taxi cab, I think. And correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, well, yeah, there's some areas of transportation are known a lot more than others. Taxis I briefly mentioned because there just isn't as much knowledge as we'd like because, generally the stories vary from city to city. Some cities, taxi cabs are largely deregulated. Others, they're highly regulated. And the certainly hallmark of the highly regulated taxi areas are, no new people can get in. And then you hear these stories, for example, in New York that, taxi cab medallions are worth millions of dollars. Now, Uber offers a technology that enables a user with an application to get access to some form of what we would call taxi service. There's nothing preventing somebody from getting a traditional taxi, but in terms of getting new entry, other forms of car service are also trying to be hooked up on Uber. And this is the thing that the incumbent taxis want to fight. They don't want this kind of competition. And, we're seeing how this is playing out in certain cities with this kind of sort of entry experiment through a new technology. And we'll just see what it does.
Yeah, I think the distinction, I didn't make it clear. Taxis are allowed to cruise the streets and look for customers. Car services, you have to call and make a reservation. And what Uber does essentially turns a car service into more of a cruising opportunity to pick up a random passenger.
Yeah,
right?
A real-time type of service that's very time responsive, which obviously is something that you can do with Uber and at the same time, compensate for cases when it's really just difficult to get a taxi. And you let somebody know you want service and somebody watching this kind of thing can provide it.
So let's start, though, with airports. Airports are kind of mysterious, I think, to most of us. We don't spend a lot of time talking about it, and we don't really understand what's going on. Airports typically now, I think almost all major airports in major cities are run by the city or the counties that they're in. But that, you say, wasn't the case. When did that change roughly, and what were the consequences of that?
Well, roughly it was during the Depression. The airports were private as air service began, and during the tremendous drop in air travel, which never was very big at that time, as it was just getting going. Airports had problems, and governments basically came in, and for the most part, municipalities have taken them over, and they're the ones that are now providing the infrastructure. And to a certain extent, it appeared to be a successful way of doing things in the same way that public highways seemed to be a successful way of doing things because it really wasn't congested. The system wasn't really sort of falling apart from excessive use, so on and so forth. And so we thought, okay, this is a very reasonable way to do things. But as expenses have grown, have delays and congestion has gotten worse, and airports as well as highways are not terribly responsive in dealing with this, we're beginning to see lots of problems with public ownership.
Well, one of the ones that fascinates me is access to the gates. So talk about how, you'd think, well, if I want to offer a flight between Washington, D.C. and Chicago, I'll just go fly my plane, if I'm an airline, to one of those places and land my plane, pick up some people, and take them to the other city, and it seems pretty straightforward. But the gates problem is a very severe constraint, correct?
Correct. What one thing as part of the story is, yes, the airports were owned and operated by the municipalities, but for expansions of the airport, terminals and the like, runways and the like, they needed somebody to guarantee the investments that they were going to make. And that came from bond purchases or bond holdings by the airlines. So the airlines actually had a very, very important relationship to, the public owners of the airports, and they were basically funding, a fair amount of the capital improvements and enhancement, if you will. Okay, but in return, they had say on the types of investments that could be made, and effectively were able to block entry to people who weren't going to be able to get gates, because the airports certainly weren't going to give them to people. And if you wanted gates, in some cases, you would have to have a whole new wing built. So with gates sort of locked up in certain places, that made it very difficult for new airlines to enter.
And they weren't all being used, right? They weren't all being used.
They were not all being used, and there were different classifications of gates. There were what we call exclusively used gates, where certain airlines just, they had the right to use these things. And then there were things where you did have some flexibility, but oftentimes, the new airline couldn't get the use of the gate at the preferred time, and these kinds of things. So, it has become a form of entry barrier. That is, yes, ideally you might want to serve an airport, but if the gate space isn't there for you and you're not going to shell out the money to go out and build additional terminal capacity, you can be out of luck. And of course, restrictions on competition are reflected in higher prices, and that's what the evidence has indicated.
How would that work in a private system, though? The private system, say a consortium of airlines that currently serve a city that own the airport, they're not going to like entry either.
Well, they're going to have, obviously, a very different financial situation in that, they're not going to be beholden on any particular airlines as dating back from, when the airports were built and regulation was set up, which, by the way, was rather a convenient situation in restricting entry because that was done under regulation. So the question about getting gate space never came up during regulation because virtually all airlines had trouble entering routes anyway. It was only deregulation where these problems started to arise. But in any case, private airports, where in many cities throughout this country, competition seems quite feasible. Right here, obviously, National, Reagan, BWI could compete. The owner is presumably going to try to get entrants who will be willing to pay the cost of using the services. They're not going to sort of immediately say, you're out of luck, you can't come in. They're going to try to work with the airlines and find ways that they're willing to pay to cover their costs. They'll accommodate them. And if demand is growing, they'll say, okay, we're going to build new terminals and handle more traffic, and we're expecting you to pay for it. But, we're not going to call on other airlines to bankroll these investments. We'll do it because we're going to be able to recover the cost by charging you. So there's obviously going to be a lot more interaction between both the airports and the users of the airport, which is sort of one of the problems we have now. You have customers that use airports, but their relationship to the landlord, so to speak, is virtually non-existent.
I'm just trying to think and imagine what the owner of a private airport, what kind of entity it might be. So, for example, if I wanted to acquire, thinking back to a city I lived in that had a little more vacant land there at St. Louis, if I wanted to acquire a large plot of land near the city of St. Louis, maybe in Illinois across the river, and build a private airport, and just offer the opportunity for airplanes to fly there, That can't happen right now, correct? And so as a result, if I'm Southwest, which wanted to go into St. Louis, it had to go to the St. Louis airport and build its own terminal, which is nuts. And unless the other part of the airport was totally full, and I suspect it wasn't. So what is strange about the current world is how difficult entry is and who controls it, right?
Right. The difficulty is how entry is. And again, let me be clear, we really do not need many, if any, new airports really being built. In other words, when I envision privatization, it's all the existing airports will be sold off, which I might add, will do quite a bit to help a lot of cities' financial situation. Because, they're going to sell off these assets and infrastructure firms are going to buy them. So, for budgetary purposes, that could be helpful, assuming away what's done with the money.
Yeah,
but in any case,
good point. But
most of these things will be sold off, and it'll be the existing airports. But then there's also something else that's even part of this is there are thousands of smaller airports that could be used, for commercial service, but they're not being used now.
Why not?
Well, basically, these are not airports that are going to get public money. So to the extent they want to compete, they're going to be at a disadvantage.
And they're not. There's no mechanism for them to use private money right now.
Not right now, not for that purpose.
So let's.
So it could look very, very different than what we've got now.
Yeah, let's think creatively for a minute. So if every city in America, either out of financial desperation or economic wisdom, decided to auction off its airports to the highest bidder, how would you imagine that situation settling down after a couple years? Would there be sufficient competition among airports to prevent them from extracting large sums of money out of customers and airlines to have access to them? Do you imagine? Would you let them freely buy the airport, do whatever they want with it?
Well, okay. First of all, I would allow for one requirement, and we've actually learned this from an experience in London, which, by the way, has privatized its airport. So, we're behind the curve here. Interestingly, the leader of capitalism in the free world tends to be really slow on the uptake in terms of privatization. Many places have actually been exploring privatization of their airports. But in any case, London made the mistake and initially sold off their airports to one infrastructure company, a foreign one, and subsequently realized that was not the right way to do it and forced that company to effectively sell two of the airports.
What should they have done?
If we're going to do that, they should have sold them to independent buyers. So that's what the approach that we should take in the U.S. At least initially, say, yes, we're going to sell off airports, but we're not going to have the same company buy all three of them, at least, in this area and give them an outright monopoly to start. We would like independent firms to purchase these things. And so then they will go head to head.
Yeah.
And, like any fundamental institutional change, like deregulation, there's obviously going to be enormous learning. And, I can envision on the one hand, we will reveal inefficiencies that we had no idea existed in terms of operations that could be vastly improved, in terms of interactions between airlines and airports, where airlines say, look, we can provide better service if you let us do this, and get rid of crazy things like tarmac rules. At the same time, there'll be shocks, as there have been following deregulations, and, undoubtedly financial crises where it'd be difficult for certain airports that may have much less traffic. So, I don't want to oversell how smooth a ride privatization will be. If people thought deregulation was tough, privatization is going to be even worse, because now we're going to have people that had no experience really operating in the private sector. But I think when all is said and done, it'll be clear this is a much more efficient way to do things, that airports who are already competing already, let's not kid ourselves, public sector airports do try to get passengers and do implicitly compete with each other. We're just going to make this explicit, and I think the results could be quite positive.
Yeah, they do a little innovation. Here in the D.C. area, there are parking garages that tell you how many spaces are available on each floor and which rows even have available spaces. I find that a very pleasant improvement in parking life, but they're not so good at minimizing the distance from where you park your car to where you get on the plane. Dulles in particular being, I find, frustrating. It used to be you had to ride the special bus. Now you've just got to ride a special internal metro system that it seems to be designed to make you go up and down a lot of escalators as much as possible. So it would be interesting to see how much more pleasant that would be if somebody was actually trying to make more money off it.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, start exploring ways in which, passengers who are unhappy could be made more happy. What is it that you want at your airport? Right now, these guys, the public airports just don't have that big an incentive since, they're getting their funds and are protected from competition. At the same time, as we're now seeing in a lot of public transportation services as well as other services, they're starting to run deficits, and that's raising problems with trying to improve services and even maintain current operations.
Let's talk about some commuting issues. I was interested to see in your paper that despite the passion for public transportation that has engulfed many American cities, the excitement of light rail and this remaining bus systems that are still in place, commuting by car remains not only the dominant form of commuting, but it's grown steadily over the last 40 years. One, why do you think that's happened? And two, what do you think of the claims that we need more public transportation, reduce dependence on the car?
Well, people always look to Europe, high-density areas, and say how great their transit systems are. And, what they fail to realize is the dynamic of the urban and suburban area. A lot of these older communities, people have been there for many hundreds of years, and the density is established. America is still a place on the move. And, when I came to D.C., and I have no doubt you were, there wasn't the expansion of Tyson's Corner and out to suburban Virginia and Maryland and so on and so forth. And now there's been just over the past 10, 20 years, there's been a huge change in this area. Well, if you have a metro system that, stops at Vienna and is not going to be able to cater to those people, they're not going to ride it. And what are they going to do? They're going to use cars. Well, you multiply that by, many experiences throughout the country, and you're talking about the inability of transit to keep up with fundamental changes in demographics in our sort of dynamic metro areas. So that's a big problem, physical problem with urban rail. Bus, you'd think, well, they're like car, they ought to be more flexible. Yes, and they run into one big problem: regulations. Trying to establish a new bus route or, changing an existing one can be quite difficult, time-consuming, the usual kinds of regulatory problems. And bus just isn't, all that good at responding quickly. And again, what's the incentive? They're still getting their subsidies. So I think, what you have with transit, and I've been hinting at this all along, is again, no real fundamental connection between the suppliers of the service and the customers. Trying to respond to the changes in the customer's needs and preferences, trying to respond to just exogenous changes in society, what have you. You have a system that's in place. It gets its subsidies. Things are good. Why change? And the public, who doesn't really know how things could be so much better, seems to go along with it, and then also shares what I would call this engineering mentality. What I mean by engineering mentality, that all the solutions to transportation are thought of in terms of more spending. if we could just put more money into rail and expand its network, if we could just put more money into a new rail system where we don't have any, all this would solve our problems. But it wouldn't, because it's not dealing with the fundamental problem of being able to respond effectively to consumer preferences. These are very expensive solutions. And of course, they're not dealing again with the fundamental problems with autos about mispricing, congestion, and the like. So the real tragedy in transportation is it seems to be more dominated by engineering than economics, where in fact so many of the solutions really involve just basic improvements in pricing and investment.
So do you think we spend enough on infrastructure? We've had an interesting debate with Robert Frank on this topic, centering around this claim you often hear that we don't spend nearly enough. Our infrastructure is crumbling. It's dangerous. How would you respond to that argument, given the point you just made?
Okay, so this is just a basic economic point that's obviously very simple for economists, but non-economists often don't recognize this. Before you make an investment decision, one, whether you should do it or not, or make it an overall assessment, are we doing enough of it or too little of it, you got to first ask the question, is the facility properly priced? I mean, just think of forget about transportation, just think of any commodity. If talking about oranges, and if oranges were priced at, a nickel, and we're constantly running out of oranges, then the instinct of most people is, well, we need to increase production of oranges and build more orange factories or groves or what have you, right? When in fact, someone else might say, who's an economist, hopefully, wait a minute, oranges are greatly underpriced.
Underpriced. By underpriced, when you say they're nickel, you mean legally there's some constraint on them, that someone has set the price of the nickel artificially.
In this case, there was an artificially low price. Yeah, this was not a market price. And say, look, let's get market pricing here, and prices go up, and all of a sudden we realize, supply is equal to demand, and the market is clearing, and we really don't need to make any investments in production of oranges, right? Well, that's the same idea with roads. Roads have an artificially low price. Cars are not charged for congestion, so they put pressure on peak capacity. Trucks are not charged efficiently for the damage they do to roads. Pay a gas tax when they really need to pay an explicit charge that reflects the damage they do to roads. This underpricing causes roads capacity to fill up, causes the roads to wear out a lot sooner, and it generates the demands for we need more spending, and our infrastructure is underfunded. I say, let's get the prices right. Now, same thing is true for airports, same kind of thing, even ports, same thing. My guess would be after getting the efficient prices, there probably is room for some efficient, and I mean efficient that would satisfy cost-benefit criteria, investments in highways in some high-density areas, certainly additional runways in high-density airports, but not the trillions of dollars that people talk about, and not nearly as much as people are led to believe. So, I think that the claims of the infrastructure crisis are grossly overstated, and what we really have is a pricing crisis. And if we can get the prices right, that could do an awful lot to improve the condition and service on our infrastructure.
Okay, I want to come back to that in a second, but I want to make a general observation first, which is what you've said now is that not only is transportation about the size of the healthcare industry, it's kind of structured the same way, where the customer doesn't do the real paying and the supplier doesn't really receive the money from the customer, and that messes up the incentives. one view would be that it works surprisingly well, given how badly designed it is. I get on my airplane, they're incredibly safe. I don't think that's due to government regulation, but they are incredibly safe. Similarly, I get in my cars, they're incredibly safe. All these methods, by the way, are much safer than they were, and they're safer long before government regulation got involved on safety. So the trends are basically unchanged over very long periods of time, and it's mainly, I think, driven by our increasing wealth and desire for safety. But my point is that it works pretty well. I agree the urban congestion thing, not so well. But the rest of it, I think we build too many roads. We repair them too often. I assume that's because of the political power of contractors, right? That creates lots of delays and wastes money, and it sucks money out of my pocket into their pocket more than is probably necessary. But you could argue it works pretty well.
The parallel to healthcare is a nice one because, I think most Americans think, healthcare, it works pretty well. And when you think about it, well, there's a reason for it. We spend an awful lot of money.
Yeah.
It should work well, given how much money we spend on it.
That's correct.
But what also is interesting is people really have no idea. Like, most people will think that transit covers its costs without even cost being defined. Transit breaks even.
Right. I get on the metro.
Metro's full.
I pay money.
All these people are on it. Yeah, I'm in New York. I use the subway. There are tons of people on it. No one is going to realize that that these transit systems cover none of their capital costs and generally a modest fraction at best of their operating costs. And the rest of this is coming from the public. Highways, it used to be that the systems were designed to break even and that we're paying out of a trust fund from the gas tax. So that's the way people pay. And, they just pay gasoline. They don't realize that a chunk of this is going to the roads. But now we're running a deficit there. And in a sense, it's been a deficit building for a long while because there's deferred maintenance. So, what we have is we really have a multi-trillion-dollar system in terms of the value of the assets. If you actually look at the value of highways, airports, our rail stock, ports, so on and forth, these are in the trillions of dollars. We've just built this enormous system. So yes, it should be pretty good given the money we've spent on it in this country. At the same time, I think the tragedy is the counterfactual. People just don't realize how much waste there is.
Compared to what?
Compared to that we could have a more efficient system. And I'm not even getting into yet the technology so that forget about also the waste, that things could be just infinitely more efficient. Let me just give you one simple thing that, I think anybody can relate to. You're driving home late at night, 12, 1 in the morning, and you hit a cross street and it's got a light and it's red. And you're waiting and you're waiting and someone's on, and it's green on the other direction and no one's coming. And you're obviously, people are often tempted just to run the thing.
Well, they used to run it, Cliff, until they took the cameras are now ruined that
right.
Was common sense strategy.
Right. But how about this, which technology could do? Look, you have stoplights, especially in these off-peak times that are timed to traffic flows. And if no one's there, boom, it's automatically green. Or it immediately switches to blinking red, so you don't have to wait. This is just a simple thing, but it's just an example, again, of just in terms of operations and improving technology, how it could be done. So I think, the bottom line is, we have this enormously expensive and valuable transportation system that's the envy of the world. There's no question. It's better than other countries' systems when you look at the thing in toto. But there's an enormous amount of waste, enormous amount of inefficiencies in terms of operations. And for what we spend, we could have something that's even better and in ways that people find hard to imagine.
Well, I think a lot of people would disagree with your claim that it's the envy of the world, right? Most people would say...
Well, no, I'm talking about the whole system.
Yeah, Europe has better trains. Their airports are nicer. their roads, the Autobahn, they're in better shape. Generally, people, I don't think there's a lot of, I agree with you. I think our system works pretty well. I could love your point that, at what price? But I don't know if we're doing so well relative to everybody else.
Our rail freight system is the envy of the world. We have a really excellent rail freight system. Other countries go in passenger system, and if you think our system is subsidized, wait till you look at what theirs is, right? Extremely, extremely inefficient and very expensive. Our road systems tend to be better. Again, other people will have urban rail systems and so on and so forth, but those two, even with the density, tend to be very highly subsidized. Our air service tends to be much better, far more competitive. I mean, look how long it was before you get affordable air travel in Europe. So I'm just saying, across the board, I think overall our systems is better.
So let me ask you a question.
Other systems better.
So let me ask you a question about the efficiency issue. I agree with you that roads are underpriced. They're zero, the money price. So time comes in as a way to ration the limited space in most urban areas. And when we expand the roads, it just takes a while for them to fill up again because people move closer to the city until they find their commute unpleasant, and they move back. They move closer or back out depending on as the people adjust. So, but the question is, if you improve the efficiency of this system, and you could say this about a lot of different parts of the transportation system, the question is, who's going to capture those gains? If you put a tax on commuting, you're going to make drivers worse off. It's true they're going to save time, but to get them to save enough time, you can't save them enough time to make up for the money because then the tax is too low. You've got to, by definition, discourage people from driving on the roads. So those gains aren't going to go to drivers. So the political mechanisms for these kind of changes to me seem very low. Having said that, here in DC and elsewhere, we're trying toll roads for the first time. And I assume, I don't know the politics of it. I assume it has partly to do with the fact that they just like the money. I don't think it's just, and maybe it's from the demand from some people who want to be able to get to work quicker and not spend so much time in their car. But how do you respond to that challenge on efficiency?
Sure. Okay, so the traditional argument against a lot of the calls for efficiency improvements has been that, yes, these things would improve efficiency, but the distributional effects, and in particular, money going from consumers to the government is what's driving the benefits.
Yeah.
That, I would say, is the conventional view. And I think this is the beauty of economic research and greater understanding of technology. It's pretty much out of date. First of all, the major improvement that we made in microeconomics research is dealing with heterogeneity. And what that basically means is that people are different. So whereas before the conventional thinking was about the average user and so on and so forth, now we can analyze in more detail, specific users who have different values of time, so on and so forth, and also users whose value of time may differ on different days.
Sure.
So, it may be the case that on any given day, someone says, look, I really got to get to work, and I'm willing to pay more to do it, a lot more, and I want the option to do it, and I'm better off by doing this. Okay, whereas other people would not feel that way, right? So it's this heterogeneity and now the ability through technology to actually charge differentiated prices that has opened people's eyes up to say, wait a minute, there can be sort of a better matching here where, yes, the prices are pretty high, but, people really have high values of time, and it's not just rich people. So, this kind of pricing thing, this could be a good thing, leaving those people who self-select to pay a lot because they really value it better off, and those who don't want to do it don't have to, and they obviously, pay much less and get worse travel time. But it doesn't even end there. Now we're starting to realize, look, once we start introducing these kind of, fundamental changes in pricing, and we then realize, God, transportation interacts with an awful lot of economic activities. So by putting in the pricing that we talked about, we realized, there may also then be, at least in the longer run, changes in land use. Greater density.
Absolutely.
And so instead of having people spread out, things are closer. Well, that means government services are going to be less costly. You don't have to string wires from, miles apart or whatever to provide some sort of public services. And now even, again, modern research is talking about the benefits of economies of agglomeration. Easier for people to meet, get around, so on and so forth.
Less carbon.
Environmental effects. Now, here's something else. People are realizing, look, I'm traveling during these congested conditions, and I'm going out there, and it's almost sort of a race to the top. I need a bigger car. I'm just around other cars, and I don't like it. I'm uncomfortable in this kind of traffic, and I want to be able to accelerate. And so I'm going to drive a large car. And indeed, we have found, just as a stylized fact, that virtually all of the improvements in engine technology since the 80s have been reflected in horsepower, virtually none in fuel economy. Well, what might be at work during the 80s? Well, since the 80s? Well, one thing is congestion that just, continue to go up and up and up. So it may very well be that a big part of our energy consumption is simply related to congestion. And if we smoothed out traffic flow and gave people less incentives to go out and try to buy big cars to feel more comfortable in traffic, you wouldn't have these what we call peer effects. That could be another benefit of congestion pricing that falls on users. So I think between heterogeneity, is the buzzword, people are different, and then thinking more broadly about how transportation interacts with so many other economic activities, slowly we're trying to build the case to say, wait a minute, this is not just simply a transfer of revenue from consumers to the government. This is something that could lead to fundamental changes that do benefit consumers.
Those are all excellent points, although I have to say that as someone who's recently spent a great deal of time commuting in the D.C. area, sometimes there were a lot of times I wanted a smaller car because traffic's moving so slowly. I would feel perfectly safe in a very small car. But I want to ask you a different question. I recently had Tyler Cowan on EconTalk, and we're talking about technology and how it might change our lives, smart machines, et cetera. And he mentioned the driverless car. I'm curious what you think is going to be the barrier to. Obviously, there's legal issues. There's going to be issues of insurance that are going to make it interesting. But is it imaginable? So when I think about a driverless car, it opens up the possibility of going 80 or 90 miles an hour, basically being in the equivalent of a high-speed train that would not crash into other cars because everybody's be going 80 to 90, and you wouldn't have the issues of bumper, tailgating, slowdown, et cetera, which are the major cause of traffic. And as a result, you'd be on a high-speed, the equivalent of a high-speed train, except when you got off, you'd still have your car if you wanted to go somewhere that wasn't connected. So to me, the potential is very high. Do you think we're going to allow them on regular roads, or could we imagine a world where roads are going to be created that will just have driverless cars and no other cars?
My view, and I think transportation illustrates this, is that there's always this sort of battle between the private and public sector to innovate and introduce technological change. I've already mentioned just one example about the stoplights that, people know if the roads were private, I assure you, private owners of roads would have traffic lights that respond in real time to traffic flows. And I think what we often have is the private sector trying to find ways to innovate, despite constraints of the public sector. And we learned this again in deregulation. Before we had deregulation, we had private entrepreneurs trying to show, yes, we could get competition in airlines. We certainly could find ways that we can compete between rail and truck, that kind of thing. Okay. Well, I think this is a textbook case that here we have a highway system that basically hasn't changed since we started building roads in this country. No sort of major innovations in improving performance.
Easy Pass. That's our closest. That's our biggest. That's our biggest innovation. Easy pass. I don't have to slow down.
Which at least around here came from a private innovator. Probably the original owner of the Greenway road, I think, was the one who put that in. I seriously doubt that it was anybody in the public sector that was the first to do this. My point being, the driverless car is effectively going to be a leapfrog technology to get over the fact that roads have not seen any innovation, where there could have been countless areas where we could have innovated, from the mundane to improvements in, asphalt design and resurfacing, lane width, that's adjusted in real time to traffic flows, even, realizing that, look, cars don't break down anymore. Why are we wasting a lane on a breakdown lane? All sorts of things that could have been changed, and even ones that are more technologically sophisticated than that. So the driverless car is coming, and it's, again, a way that the private sector, in this case, the automobile companies, have been trying to, in a sense, compensate for inefficiencies in the road system. So technologically, we're going to have it, and I think as people get new cars, they'll realize, wait, the technology that I see in my new car that I can see in this, screen on your dashboard, what's behind me, that's the same kind of thing that they're using in a driverless car. There's just cameras everywhere, and cars will be able to effectively communicate with each other. So it's an exciting development, and in principle could obviously improve traffic flows. Driverless cars do not rubberneck when there are accidents, so you're not going to have that problem, and countless other things. But you're right. The problem is the driverless cars are going to have to operate on the public infrastructure. Well, what's one obvious problem? Potholes. If the roads are not properly maintained, your nice driverless car is going to start slowing up and probably going to even be sensitive to the roads beneath it.
They'll figure that out.
Okay. But it's going to be a problem in the sense that you're going to start getting stop and go traffic. Again, signaling. If you have signals that are not really responding to real time traffic flows, but just continue to go on this, here's red, here's green, so on and so forth. Again, that's going to sort of undercut what the driverless cars are trying to do. So I think the bottom line is yes, we're going to be able to get driverless cars. I think it's unfortunate, though, that we'll probably have to get them still on public roads. It's sort of the same problem that airlines have or airplanes have operating on the publicly managed air traffic control system. That's something that's at least more visible. People know, or at least have heard, that we're trying to build a new air traffic control system based on satellite technology instead of radar. But I think they've also heard the horror stories. Wait, this thing is years, behind in being implemented. It's, having cost overruns, and, who knows when we're going to get this. It's the same kind of thing. You have the private mode that's trying to operate on this public facility, and you have people in the public sector that basically have to manage new technology, and they're not up to doing it.
You note in your paper that airplane travel has been, the delays in travel have gotten longer. I was struck by two things when I saw that. One is how small the increase has been. It has gotten longer, the ground time versus flying time. The ground time is longer, but it hasn't gotten a lot longer. Having said that, it seems to me that there's a lot more caution about traveling in bad weather, and there's a lot of lengthy delays, not just turnaround being slower, but the canceling and delaying of flights. Am I wrong on those 2 points?
Well, in terms of technology, we've got better in some ways in that planes can certainly sort of see around wind shear. I wouldn't say see, but they're navigated well around wind shear. Remember, this is all consistent with our safety data, right? Where it is now so rare, fortunately, that we don't experience airplane crashes anymore. So I think we're certainly doing better there. But I think again that's a lot of learning on the part of pilots, better training, and improvements in uses of technology. So I don't think that's our problem. Our problem is just there's a lot of planes in the sky, And interacting with weather, you're going to continue to have congestion until you can change technology, which is what the satellite-based system is going to do. In the same way that driverless cars effectively will increase more capacity, cars can be closer together. The new satellite-based system will increase capacity. Planes can be closer together. And that's really going to be a major solution to delays.
I want to get into some big picture questions in a minute. Before I do, though, talk about what's going on in the parking world. I was surprised to see there's been some innovation, at least in some cities. I've never experienced it personally, but that the amount of time that people spend searching for parking is a big part of urban congestion. You note in the paper. What's one of the technological things that's changing there?
Well, again, you touched on this. You go to an airport, you have a sense about where a parking space is. Again, we have technology that can enable us to do that. You can embed sensors in parking spaces and have applications to say, hey, this one's available, and you can even then set real-time prices. And various cities are exploring those kinds of innovations. Again, this is an example of trying to use improvements in information technology, interact them with transportation facilities, and make much more efficient use of the available capacity. And that could easily be done in parking, as I said, in terms of reducing search so that people could know in real time what spaces are available, obviously be more efficient to price the ones that are in the more congested areas or being used in more congested times. But again, in the public sector, these things are difficult. And, when I've been saying, we have no idea how much better the system could be, these are examples. The system could be so much better, not so much because, we could be building, more roads or investing in more highways. It's because we can be introducing technological innovations and advances much quicker than we've been doing so before. And again, if I can, point to a parallel with deregulation, that was one of the lessons that we learned from deregulation is how much innovation and technological advance had been held back because of regulation.
What are some examples of that? So you're talking about the late 70s when trucking and in air travel was railroads and trucking were all relatively deregulated, or at least regulated less. What were some of the innovations that happened in the subsequent period that might not have happened otherwise?
Well, people simply don't realize that using information technology has vastly improved railroads. If you wanted to know where a freight shipment was during the regulated period, you'd call them up and they'd say, we have to check our camera. And you say, what? What would happen is railroads would bring their cars into a yard, and then there'd be a camera taking pictures of the cars that came in. And they would look at those and say, well, there we go. That's where your shipment is, or that's when we know where it is. Now we have real-time identification, and people know exactly where their shipment is. And people say, well, we could have done that during regulation, sure, but what was the incentive? Where were innovations going to be generating more profit for these companies? They still face regulations and constraints. So what regulation did is just open up the incentive, and in some cases opportunities, like airlines could then dramatically change both their networks and their pricing algorithms, and again introduce new technology to do yield management. So these were sort of basic things, but they did greatly improve the provision and operations of intercity transportation. The potential in so much of the infrastructure to do these things and apply innovations and technology is even greater. And that's why my belief is the payoff will be even bigger.
So let's have a thought experiment here. I want to make Cliff Winston the transportation czar, but he's still Cliff Winston. He's not going to be subject to the whatever awful political incentives the current transportation czars are under. What do you think are the two or three biggest things we could, or that would have the biggest impact? What are the two or three policy changes? I have a feeling I think I know one of them already, but What are the two or three you would list that are the biggest mistakes we're making that we could do better if we had more economic wisdom and less political oversight?
Well, I think there's one general mistake, and that's just the notion of experimentation. What we learned that worked in regulatory reform were experiments. In other words, the fact that we were able to point to California and Texas as having lower airline fares for flights of comparable distance on interstate routes, opened policymakers' eyes. And I think that's the kind of thing that the Department of Transportation under Secretary Mary Peters and Assistant Secretary Tyler Duvall were trying to do, have experiments. And so my general thing would be, look, let's start trying experiments in ways to get things to be more efficient. People know what these things are. I mean, most of what I'm saying for anybody who's in the public or even the private sector is no surprise. They know about these things. The question is finding places where you can conduct experiments. So to try to put in, road pricing based on real-time traffic flows, allowing competition with no constraints from, other kinds of transit companies, not just the traditional bus and rail. These kinds of things. And let private entrepreneurs think of these things. They're going to do a better job than I can. That's the kind of thing, again, we learned from deregulation is people actually in this line of work are going to come up with important ideas and innovative ideas. So I would say that's sort of the general mindset I'm trying to push for is experiments that start showing the public, look, this can be much better. And the advantage of America is we got a lot of cities and a lot of states, and we can start trying to do these kinds of things. That was really direction, as I said, that the previous DOT people wanted to go, and unfortunately, they were constrained in doing so.
In terms of technology, let's close with this. We've talked about the driverless car. Elon Musk has proposed the Hyperloop, which is this wild concept of, I don't know, how would you describe it? A slingshot of, I can't describe it. Google it out there.
The time tunnel.
We'll put a link up to it. You got to see it to really understand it. Which of these things or others that I haven't mentioned, which of these might be really about to happen and could really change? We have other proposals, high-speed rail, which I think people are starting to realize not really the best idea, way too expensive, unlikely to be a useful use of public funds. Close with what technologies might transform the transportation sector?
Yeah, driverless car, absolutely. That will have a huge impact both in reducing delays and improving safety in this country. And also then give people a sense that, look, transportation is related to so many other activities and free up people to do other things. And I think also the satellite-based air traffic control system will also be excellent. It'll make safety that much better for air transportation. It'll improve routings. It'll improve speed. It'll reduce delays. It'll effectively expand the sky in congested areas and help there. But, beyond that, there's still other things that we just don't know. Transportation used to be the place that was the source of all the major innovations or among the major innovations of mankind. The jet plane, the car, so on and so forth. It's been a long time, many decades now since we've had these kinds of things. I think part of the problem really is the government's pervasive role and the public sector provision and management and operation. I would like to see, much more involvement of the private sector. And I think despite the constraints of the public sector, the private sector is still trying to do things, e.g. the driverless car. Private sector could certainly get involved in provision of air traffic control systems that are private. It's going on in other parts of the world. That's another thing that most Americans don't realize is that there are other places where private people are much more involved. So I think that's the kind of thing that we want to look for is major innovations of the sort that we have, but just also a greater realization about how transportation intersects with so many other areas of our life that is just so important to greatly improve this system and make it as innovative as possible.
My guest today has been Cliff Winston of the Brookings Institution. Cliff, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you. Good to talk with you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.